Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Balmain Institute event. We're very glad that you decided to check in with us tonight. I am Mo McCarthy, president of the Balmain Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Sue Butler as our speaker, and to thank Ray Stevens, a member of our executive committee, for organizing our event this evening. Presenting these Zoom meetings occur costs, at their own costs, and the executive committee and I would greatly appreciate if you would consider making a small donation to help us out with these costs. You can find the bank details for the Balmain Institute at the bottom of the MailChimp announcements you receive from us. Thank you. If you are a newcomer to the Balmain Institute and wish to receive regular notices of our events, please go to our website, balmaininstitute.com, scroll to the bottom of the screen to a box that's labeled subscribe, click on that, and you will subsequently receive our events notices. It is free. Now, before we start the evening, I want to ask Margaret to just have a minute to explain a few technical tips for us to make the evening easier for all of us. Margaret?
Okay, welcome everyone. It's great that you're with us. You are all muted, I'm afraid, but I'd like you to stay that way, and because it will interfere with the presentation if you don't stay muted. If you do unmute, just find your mute button and press it again. Thank you. Now, if you can see a little icon that allows you to choose between speaker versus gallery mode, you'll probably enjoy this better in speaker mode. Otherwise, you're looking at very small images of lots of people. We welcome your questions and look forward to doing our best to ensure that they're all answered. Would you please type your questions in the chat boxes and just send it to everybody. Thanks very much.
Okay, terrific. The Balmain Institute acknowledges that we meet on the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the lands of Balmain and Birch Grove. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. This is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. May we walk these lands gently and in peace. May we remain supportive of the struggle of First Nations people for constitutional recognition and the enactment of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. As people of the 21st century, we live with words on a daily basis. Social media, newspapers, books, YouTube, television, online movies, and entertainment, our computers, apps, and all the access we have through them to the world of words. Words create our meanings and understandings of the life around us. They provide avenues of mental escape and help forge our conscious thoughts, thinking, and insight. And they provide us the means of expressing ourselves, however badly that may be. For all our association and dependence on words, we are unlikely to pay attention to the exact meanings individual words have or how they are used. In addition, we are challenged by the advent of new words, how words change over time in meaning and in use, and how they have their own history of recognition and documentation. Such information is provided for us in the Macquarie Dictionary, the National Dictionary, in its print, online, digital, and app formats. Tonight's speaker is a renowned wordsmith and lexicographer par excellence, Sue Butler. She began her association with the profession of words in the 1970s as a young research assistant and has spent her long and fruitful career ever since as an arbiter, observer, critic, scholar, author, and editor. Most particularly, she has overseen the emergence of the first edition of the Macquarie Dictionary in 1981 through to its 7 editions in 2017 and the creation of its digital forms. Her association, therefore, with the language Australians speak and define as our own is deeply entwined with her own career. We are privileged to have Sue Butler with us tonight, exploring what we could call the darker side of word crafting. She will be sharing with us her insights into the particular way words can be used negatively as weapons to denigrate, attack, mock, insult, or deflate others. It is my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Sue Butler. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you very much. Now I have to just pause to share screen again, don't I? Okay, is that that's looking good? Okay, I'll start. Weaponising words. This talk is about how to insult people effectively, how to slag off at them, put them down, demean them in the eyes of others. Method 1 is the simplest. It is the verbal equivalent of hitting people over the head with a blunt instrument. It is solid verbal abuse, usually with a taboo word or two thrown in. You can find lots of examples at the moment in the howls of outrage on social media in response to Scott Morrison's Father's Day jaunt. The interesting thing about taboo words is that we have to be taught to react to them. When we're small children, we pick up on what adults and older children are saying and watch our parents shudder as we experiment with these interesting new words. The reaction is powerful, and so we learn a valuable lesson, not just so that we can rebel against our parents and teachers or dish out verbal violence in the playground, but so that we have something effective to say when we hit our thumb with a hammer. There are ways of getting around taboo words. We can abbreviate them. Now, I'm going to say a few taboo words, just to warn you. For example, FFS is the initialism formed from for fuck's sake. We can modify the word. For example, there is the genteel American shoot instead of shit. Everyone knows what you're saying without your having to actually say it. There's just one variation on taboo words that's worth mentioning. Just as you can, in jest, pretend to clip someone over the ear or punch their jaw, stopping, of course, at the last moment. In the same way, you can turn a verbal assault into a joke. It all depends on the context and the tone of voice. It has long been commented that in Australian English, to be called a bastard can be complete condemnation or warm affection. As Macquarie Dictionary says, a bastard can be a despicable person or, used colloquially and without any pejorative sense, any person. And the quotation given is, whoops, daisy, that's, are you porridge-eating Presbyterian bastard, said Andy. We couldn't think of getting married without you. This is obviously a positive use of bastard. Bugger similarly can be positive or negative. You're a right bugger and you old bugger are two entirely different things. This is pretty straightforward, so we can move on to method 2. There are situations where we want to put someone down, but taboo words are not allowed. This is the case in most offices, and it's notably the case in Parliament. What to do? This is where our second tier of offensive words comes into play. These are words which are not crudely taboo, but which are clearly put-downs. Every parliament has a list of what are termed unparliamentary words, which are banned from being used in Parliament. There are the obvious ones: liar, hypocrite, sod, grub, dog, dope, etc. There is also the odd misunderstanding. the Speaker of the Northern Territory Parliament in 2006 ruled that buggerlugs was unparliamentary. And this must surely be because he heard the taboo word bugger in it. It is an English regionalism from Dorset, originally from bug, a pompous person, and lug, a pole. A bug, a lug, or effigy on a pole, was akin to a scarecrow. In Australian English, it's become an affectionate address, often to a child, or a mild reproof, but there is nothing taboo in it. Straightforward abuse in Parliament can be of the orthodox kind, such as twerp, turd, jackass, or pissant, or of a slightly more fanciful nature, such as vexatious geriatric, political barracuda, economic primitive, or boudoir bandicoot. These are all drawn from our very own Parliament. The game is to say something truly insulting in the knowledge that you can then happily withdraw when the Speaker asks you to, but what has been said cannot be unsaid. For example, Mr. Bailey, you two-faced, double-standard, little fat, arrogant twit. Mr. Stone, I ask that that remark be withdrawn. I understand the member is on a warning. Parliamentarians are good at splitting hairs. To use an offensive word against a person is one thing. To use it against an activity or practice is another. And so we have Mr. Freudenstein. The money will be ploughed back into Consolidated Revenue Fund to finance the ratbag activities of the Minister for Consumer Affairs. Mr. Acting Speaker, order. The Minister has taken offence at what the Honourable Member for Young has said. I ask that the Honourable Member for Young withdraw the word ratbag in regard to the Minister. Mr. Freudenstein, I did not call the Minister a ratbag. I said that he engaged in ratbag activities, which is a very nice splitting hairs. The most successful offensiveness cannot be pinned down and so does not incur the Speaker's wrath. Mr. Rann, all the Honourable Member for Sturt is concerned about is growing opium poppies, and from the look of him, sometimes it seems he's tried a few samples. Keating was past master of this with such phrases as all tip and no iceberg, said about Costello, a shiver looking for a spine to run up about Howard, an unrepresentative swill about the Senate. But he came a cropper with scumbag, which is taboo, and the general public held a dim view of that at the time. There are words which are not in themselves taboo or overly offensive, but which can be used in such a way that it is clear they're intended to be offensive. So eventually the Speaker declares them unparliamentary and they join the list of banned words in Parliament, which explains some of the odd surprises in these lists of unparliamentary words. Some examples are tired and emotional, a euphemism for intoxicated, and terminological inexactitude, a lie. In 2015, the Victorian Parliament was forced to ban the colloquialism rort and alongside it rorter. It was the frequency of use that finally got to the Speaker, with members of the opposition shouting rort loudly and repeatedly. The game then became to find synonyms for rorter. Some supplied helpfully by members of the general public were to do with words like dodge and lurk and con. I was consulted and I suggested that an old Australianism like illiwaka would keep the Speaker puzzled for long enough to get some mileage out of it. Illiwaka is a noun derived from the phrase to whack the illy, meaning to perform a confidence trick. This is obsolete slang in which illy is eely, which is in turn a shortened form of Eilespie, which is backslang for spieler, a German word for a gambler, which was borrowed into American English in the 1850s, but then transferred to Australian English where it had greater currency. It's interesting the way politicians in particular can take a word which has potted along in Australian English for decades and somehow supercharge it so that it becomes the insult of the moment. In Australia, a kid who can whinge effectively is a nightmare for a parent, but this is a recognised behaviour among children and there's lots of advice on how to deal with it. It's when adults whinge that matters become more serious. The aspects of adult whinging that are particularly unpleasant are that it is complaining about something that can't be helped, or is in fact a trivial matter, or about something that the whinger refuses to do anything about. It is complaining that goes on at some length, is exaggerated beyond what is warranted, and is totally self-centered. The moment you label someone a whinger, you are immediately belittling the significance of their complaint and you're attacking them personally. Words associated with whinger are crybaby and sook. A whinger has no ability to deal with life's problems and certainly can't equal the courage and resilience displayed by the battler. The whinger has no strength of character. Greiner, in opposition, was dubbed whinger, whiner, one-line Greiner. Keating called John Howard, as leader of the opposition, just a little whinger, whinging around on radio stations, attacking me personally, hour in, hour out. Latham described Gerard Henderson as that most despised of Australian characters, a little whinger. In this year of the pandemic, various politicians have labelled other politicians as whingers. Anastasia Palaszczuk called the New South Wales government whingers when they complained about the state of origin being played in Queensland. All they do is whinge, whinge, whinge. Scott Morrison said the opposition was whinging when they criticised the pace of the vaccine rollout. So it came as no surprise that the representatives of the federal government employed it against Daniel Andrews. Andrews, in response, came up with the line, "the Prime Minister for New South Wales." And after that, the taunts of whinger ceased and the federal government decided to treat all states equally, at least until just recently. I remember that arrogant was also used for a while as shorthand for a politician who disregarded the expectations of the populace. In a rare moment of humility for a politician, Bill Shorten owned up to being arrogant because he had failed to put himself in the shoes of the Australians who felt anxious about his big taxing, big spending policy platform. Canberra politicians generally are described as arrogant and complacent because they're too far from the real world. Simon Crean and Bill Kelty were called intellectually arrogant, and that is something that really sticks in a worker's craw, to quote one building union official. But the politician perceived most commonly as aggressive and arrogant was Paul Keating. Method 2 is often clever, but is still an attempt to hit someone over the head with a verbal weapon. And now we come to method 3. This one takes a word used positively by one's opponent and turns it on its head with the application of sarcasm. The best example of this is the term PC. Popular belief had it that the notion of political correctness began with Mao Zedong. In the Little Red Book, he asks, "Where do correct ideas come from?" This may be drawing a long bow, but there are two aspects of the Chinese experience that are relevant. One is the use of correctness to mean in line with what the government wants, and the other is the idea of the break with the past, since the only way to maintain correctness is to have nothing to do with that incorrectness known as history. The first example of the use of the term political correctness appears in a document emanating from the American National Organization for Women, whose president commented in 1975 that what they were doing was both intellectually and politically correct. That is to say, in line with feminist philosophy and government policy. This is a straightforward use of the expression before it developed its later twists and perversions. The meaning of political correctness became more highly charged as it came to be used in relation to organisations that took stands on social issues. Rather than meaning in line with government policy, it came to mean in line with a movement taking up a particular cause. The relationship to a program setter was still there, but the group setting the program varied. Finally, the word acquired its general derogatory overtones when, said with a sneer, it was used as a weapon against such groups by their opponents, who either didn't like the social change advocated or didn't like it being introduced by upstart groups who were not in the conservative tradition of authority. And sometimes these opponents objected to the break with the past, which was an inevitable consequence of change. Sometimes they objected to what they saw as intellectual thuggery on the part of extremists in radical groups. And that these groups were engineering changes in the language as part of their strategy caused particular anguish. There were extremists among the radicals, for example, wanting to change manufacture, literally making by hand, manu by hand, because it had the sequence of letters MAN at the start, was carrying things too far. And those who hounded a US government worker out of office because he said he would have to be niggardly with government funds were equally misguided. They heard the word nigger instead of the English word niggard, meaning a miserly person, a word which has a Scandinavian origin with a basic sense of narrow and thus mean. The word dates back to Old English. But often ridiculous examples of PC or poll call words were made up to mock the group seeking change. The Challenge series, vertically challenged for short, follicularly challenged for bald, and so on, was a running joke which led to opportunistic improvisation at the expense of those labelled PC. Public servants are particularly prone to PC euphemism, as Don Watson delights in pointing out. Sensitive issues demand the greatest obscurity of language. The culling of brumbies can only be discussed under the heading, the depopulation of feral horses. Such horses can be removed or their survival managed. Removed, I think, means killed, and their survival managed, who knows what that means, but it doesn't sound good. Any effort at language engineering can produce outrage. In February this year, news reported that there was a move at the ANU to replace breastfeeding with chest feeding. Australia's leading university has encouraged staff to use parent-inclusive language, such as chest feeding instead of breastfeeding, and human milk rather than mother's milk. Similarly, the terms mother and father should be replaced with gestational and non-gestational parent, according to the Australian National University's Gender Inclusive Handbook. I myself was briefly taken in by the news story, I have to admit, but when I investigated, it turned out that this was a malicious distortion of what was in the handbook. Mothering and breastfeeding was still fine, but what was being added was the option to talk about chest feeding if you happen to be dealing with trans and non-binary parents. This was supported by the Australian Breastfeeding Association. Various people describe the news story as a beat-up, but the heat that the story engendered shows that we're still reacting along the same lines evident in the move to non-sexist language. PC is still a slur that you can cast on the people that you might once have labelled bleeding heart liberals, Balmain basket weavers, thought police, intellectual elites, chattering classes, cafe latte set, feminazis, academic snobs, ideologues, do-gooders. And to this we add, from Scott Morrison in his address to the Business Council of Australia in April this year, the people who frequent inner city wine bars. That was a sneer at the environmentalists. A more recent example that illustrates the path from positive use to twisted use is woke. The forms of the verb wake in Black American English are wake, woke, woke. The baby is woke we would say the baby is awake or the baby has woken. And I be woke means I am now awake. In 1962, woke took on the figurative meaning of with it or well-informed. Cool people were woke. A decade later, it had an extra political tinge in the context of Black rights and came to mean alert to racial or social discrimination and injustice. That definition is from the OED, which provides the following citation. I've been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm going to stay woke and I'm going to help him wake up other Black folk. Being woke was the same as having your consciousness raised, but a lot easier to say. Consciousness raising was also a term of the early 1970s. So now we come to the sneering use of woke. The news reporting on the Dr. Seuss story earlier this year provides a good example. Woke revolution, censorship of Dr. Seuss runs from silly to sinister. The push to cancel famous children's author Dr. Seuss runs from silly to sinister, according to Sky News host James Morrow. The foundation supposedly devoted to preserving the children's author's memory, Dr. Seuss Enterprises, has condemned books like If I Ran the Zoo and Scrambled Eggs Super. Mr. Morrow said, how good is it that we live in the most perfect moment in all of human history when everything that came before us was just backward and benighted. Dr. Seuss, the delightful author whom no less than Barack and Michelle Obama praised in 2015, saying pretty much all the stuff you need to know is in Dr. Seuss, has now, just 6 years later, been consumed by the woke revolution. Again, you notice that feeling that there is this abrupt change with everything that went before, and people resist this. I had just bought a set of Cat in the Hat books for my granddaughter, so I was interested in this and initially somewhat sceptical about what the issue might be. The zoo book belongs to an older way of thinking about zoos and circuses, that animals were there for our entertainment. I don't mind letting that book go to support a new approach to what the purpose of a zoo should be and how they should treat animals. The scrambled eggs in Scrambled Egg Super are stolen from all kinds of exotic birds just because the little boy, who is the hero of the story, is bored with the taste of ordinary scrambled eggs. To think that I saw it on Mulberry Street had an illustrator who favoured a stereotype of the Chinese that we have ceased to think is acceptable. Slanty eyes, funny clothes, a somewhat manic look. I think that we have such a shallow understanding of Chinese culture today that we don't need slanty eyes and pointy hats as our childhood introduction to them. I'm happy to ditch that one as well. And that still leaves us with the major Dr. Seuss stories to enjoy. So, am I part of the woke revolution? I feel that describing my decisions and those of the Seuss Foundation as woke is simply an attempt to demean, an honest effort not to propagate racial stereotypes and to jettison an outmoded attitude to our relationship with animals. In the same way you can attack someone by labelling them woke, you can, if a person indicates they're unhappy with racial slurs or hate speak of any sort, label them a woke scold and accuse them of just woke scolding. This, for me, has that old sense of scold as an abusive woman. The word scold is from Scandinavian languages and meant a poet. The theory is that it was at some stage used ironically. And that may seem strange, but scoldship or poetry has in Icelandic law the specific sense of libel in verse. This is an early example, it would seem, of the kind of meaning development that we're talking about with PC and woke. Someone berates you and you say, oh, you're just a poet. But the woke people can fight back with humour. In April 2021, Alice Shay's PhD posted the following on Twitter. After spending my life abstaining from fairy bread, I have been fed up for too long. The term fairy is offensive and outdated and should not be used to refer to classic Australian food. She set up the petition on change.org and waited for the reaction. Various people in the media, notably in news, responded with outrage. Then it was revealed that Alex Chay's PhD was the creation of the chaser. Method 4. This is the last group of weaponised words that I want to discuss. These are words which move from having some meaning to having the meaning we want them to have. And these are powerful words indeed. The first one I want to talk about is un-Australian. How do we get to be un-Australian? There are several answers. Entrepreneur John Singleton's remains the most succinct. It is un-Australian to drive past a pub. Former politician Fred Daly's definition is, I'm afraid, rather dated. I suppose there is nothing more un-Australian than a tea bag. I actually have sympathy for this point of view. While I don't go so far as to swing the billy around my head every morning at tea time just to prove my Australianness, I do prefer the old-fashioned pot with leaves in it to the tea bag. But I'm conscious of being surrounded by battalions of tea bags claiming the support of many Australians, so I would be hard put to call them un-Australian. I also realise that the term leaf tea has come into existence precisely because tea bags are now the norm. The Howard dictum was that we were un-Australian if we didn't have Australian values. And I dread that term almost as much as un-Australian itself, but we'll come to that a little later. It did lead to a rethink of the dictionary entry for un-Australian. In its early 19th century use, this term simply meant not characteristic of Australia. So, for example, the landscape of England, with its pale blues and greens, was described as un-Australian. In 1886, the country near Adelaide was described as un-Australian, reminding the traveller, as it did, of the garden plains of the Rhine. Then in the early 20th century, the term was used pejoratively to mean that the person tagged in this way had primary loyalties which did not attach to the Australian nation, but to some other country or institution. This use of the term followed in the path of un-American. Thus, communism and any left-wing organisation in Australia, like the unions, was suspect because of its ideals and its internationalism. Catholicism made one a servant of the Pope in Rome. A pastor, J.J. Franklin, speaking in 1917 on the topic of Romanism in Australia, argued that the Roman Catholic Church was a political institution which was advancing its own interests in Australia to the detriment of the majority of Australians. Roman Catholic influence in Australian life was essentially a foreign element. It was both un-British and un-Australian. Sectarianism was still a hot topic in the 1930s, when the president of the Queensland Council of Churches, Norman Miller, noted the incompatibility of the theories of papal sovereignty and of sovereignty of a democratic state. The meaning of un-Australian then shifted to be not in line with Australian culture. Sidney Baker comments in his book, The Australian Language, published in 1966, unlike Britain, Australia has no great enthusiasm for eccentrics. Hence, the use of ratbag for eccentric carries a certain disapproval, and ratbaggery some suggestion that such conduct is un-Australian, or at any rate, not quite acceptable in this environment. This meaning of un-Australian is the most enduring one. Dobbing, for example, is still un-Australian. We were nevertheless prepared to use the term humorously, as in this snippet from Tall, Bronzed and Handsome by Colin Sinclair, published in 1968. The reports on how Colonel Splutteroff was unmasked as a spy were quite inaccurate. One said, for instance, that he aroused suspicion by his un-Australian behaviour in walking past a television set operating in a shop window while a horse race was being broadcast. Another claimed that he was picked up as an undesirable alien when he offered his bus seat to a little old lady laden with shopping. But then came the 1990s politics of the Howard and Hanson kind, and un-Australian degenerated to being a smear word that could mean almost anything. Any dictionary has difficulty with words that have zero denotation while being full bottle on connotation, and that have no meaning but are powerfully weaponized. The definition that tries to capture this reads, violating a pattern of conduct, behaviour, etc., which, it is implied by the user of the term, is one embraced by all Australians. So if you think that people who eat spinach are beyond the pale, then you can label spinach eaters un-Australian. This carries with it the assumption that all Australians think the way you do and will line up beside you in their loathing of the detestable spinach eaters. What makes you un-Australian changes with the times and with the speaker. It's almost too difficult for the dictionary to pin it down. The only possible retaliation to this use of un-Australian was to lampoon it. And again, we turn to the chaser for help here. Peter Rock, who has a Southern Cross sticker on his car and enjoys yelling at foreigners on the train in his spare time, announced to friends on Friday that calling someone un-Australian was based on facts, not opinion. Take, for example, that terrorist-looking guy, Ahmed, from down the street. It's just true to say that Ahmed doesn't know word for word every Cold Chisel song. That's un-Australian. It's got nothing to do with the colour of his skin, although that's pretty un-Australian too, come to think of it. I think we've returned to the position where no one can use un-Australian seriously, and that is a good thing. Australian values starts out rather like un-Australian, as being simply the values which Australians espouse and which are part of the makeup of typical Australian. So Macquarie has a careful definition. Values which are assumed to be central to generally accepted social mores in Australia and which may be thought to reflect Australian culture and history. You can fill in for yourself what the social mores are and which bit of Australian history is relevant. By contrast, the Department of Home Affairs is quite confident about what Australian values are. They include the familiar virtues of respect for others, tolerance, the fair go, equality of opportunity, and so on. And one interesting paragraph says that Australian values include parliamentary democracy, whereby our laws are determined by parliaments elected by the people, those laws being paramount and overriding any other inconsistent religious or secular laws. This displays a fine use of inverted commas, signalling a distancing from the term being used. It is the equivalent of so-called. The laws of this land have no belittling punctuation. On the other hand, religious and secular laws have the inverted commas to show that these are not really laws at all. I understand perfectly what religious laws are and how these might differ from the law of the land, but I'm not clear at all on what the secular laws might be that also differ from the law of the land. Almost every Prime Minister in recent times has had a go at defining Australian values. Howard thought that mateship summed it up, but didn't get the word inserted into the preamble of the Constitution, as he hoped. Peter Costello lined up Australian values with a rule of law, democracy, and a secular state. Then Howard linked it to what was taught in schools. Private schools apparently had Australian values in spades, whereas public schools were value neutral, or in other words, valueless. This story appeared in The Age in 2005. The National Framework for Values Education in Australian Schools, released in May by Federal Education Minister Brendan Nelson, sets out 9 values for Australian schooling: care and compassion, doing your best, fair go, freedom, honesty and trustworthiness, integrity, respect, responsibility, and understanding, tolerance and inclusion. The government wants these values taught in all Australian schools. Dr. Nelson's list has been outlined on a poster that schools must display prominently for a share of $33 billion in federal funding. It seems apparently Australian values could be bought. Brendan Nelson went on to say that Islamic schools didn't teach these values at all. A fair go has been a popular Australian value, and Morrison has, for obvious reasons, been stressing resilience. He had previously, at the start of 2020, equated Australian values with standards. He was the Prime Minister for Standards, who was going to insist on the correct dress code for citizenship ceremonies. Anyone who turned up in thongs and boardies was out. But bushfires, floods, COVID, and finally mouse plagues has made him dig a bit deeper. More humorous definitions have included an obsession with sport, the celebration of the nature strip, the consumption of democracy sausages, hating but respecting authority, hating Americanisms, except for clothes, TV, films, music and food, and a deep suspicion of any hint of imagination. So, as with un-Australian, the fact that there is no fixed content for the term Australian values means that we can define it as we like and label people as having or lacking Australian values to suit our purpose. Insults range from blunt to subtle. The hardest ones to deal with are in the last 2 categories. But I was asked to respond to the accusation of being woke, I wouldn't know how to begin. And if I was asked to define un-Australian and Australian values, I would also be speechless. These are the insults that give you no recourse except by way of humour. If someone knocks you over the head or shouts taboo words at you, it is a shock. It says, I hate you, but it doesn't totally invalidate your existence. But if someone dismisses you as PC, woke, or un-Australian, you are obliterated from their world. It is hard to fight that. That's it from me.
Thanks very much, Sue, for this wonderful talk tonight. It's very interesting to really consider the various ways that we can insult people, from easy to more difficult. And I particularly liked your way of saying that you can completely obliterate someone by insulting them in a way that there's no way that you can answer. I think that we've seen that a lot, particularly in the last election. A big thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. We'll be sending everyone who registered for the talk a link of the recording that's been made of Sue's talk in a follow-up email to be sent to you in the coming days. So thanks also to Margaret Vickers and Michelle French for providing our technical support and detail for the evening. And watch for information about our next speaker in the coming weeks. Stay, and we now have questions. So, Margaret, what do you have?
Okay, so here's a question that came in, and that is there evidence of the use of language online, for example, language in Twitter or in text messages, that is affecting the way we use language more broadly?
I think the thing about Twitter and that kind of social media is that it is pretty well completely unfiltered. It's not published in that sense. There's no gatekeepers and people sort of controlling the language, and it is a kind of halfway house between speech and writing. So it has a lot of the flavour of speech and colloquialism in it. Apart from broadening our knowledge of swear words and keeping us up to date with that, I don't think there's anything in it that we wouldn't encounter in speech, colloquial speech, normally.
Okay. What do you have any comment on emojis?
Well, again, because these sort of text messages and the kind of writing that we do is this halfway house between speech and writing. It's missing out on a lot of the techniques and framework of written texts to guide you as to the speaker's intention, mood, their attitude to you and their attitude to what they're saying to you. So I think that everyone has found that emojis actually perform a very useful function in conveying that kind of emotional context, in cueing you as to how you're supposed to take this. Even the lack of punctuation is sometimes presents a difficulty. I sent a text message to someone saying yay, but I neglected to put in the exclamation mark. And they looked at it and thought, oh, is she angry with us or something? I just said yay instead of saying yay. So it is important. And if I'd added an emoji to show my lovely smiling face, everything would have been clear.
Terrific. Here's just a comment. You have an elegant way of cutting through the clutter of modern language. That's just a little compliment to you from one of our viewers.
Thank you very much.
Digital and social media are exposing us to global uses of language and US terms that have a US history, like woke. Is Australian English becoming less distinctively Australian?
We are, like every English in the world, very much influenced by American English at the moment. But then you have to think back to our colonial period of history where we felt exactly the same way about British English. We were desperate to know all the sort of latest in colloquialisms and cool ways of saying things that were coming to us from London, so that we could keep up with London and step off the boat and sound really cool and with it. So we are a small country in the scheme of things, and we're bound to be influenced by a bigger English than ours. It was British English in the past, it's American English now. But through all of that, we have to forge our own way, and that means shaping our own language. And these days, with technology, communications and so on, it's even more important to be an Australian in our own community and also a global citizen. I sort of described as having two passports, and you must have both. You can't have one. If you attempt to belong in the Australian community and you're sounding like an American all the time, this is not going to go down well. You have to be able to use the words that are meaningful to us. A poet like Les Murray has to be able to use the language of rural Australia and the colloquialisms of that, and know that people will understand him and that they will get the colour of the language from him. He can't reduce it all to what's the word, basic English, and he certainly can't write it all in American English, because he has to be authentic in his own English. And I mean, I'm picking Les Murray as an example, but it applies to all of us. And it's not just us. I remember in Singapore, there was a lot of comment on the way the younger generation, young things in their 20s, were all adopting cool American English. And the Singaporeans felt exactly the same way. If you went overboard and used too much Americanism, there would be raised eyebrows. It would be considered gauche in the extreme. So you had to retain your Singaporeanness for Singaporeans and be able to go over to New York and, talk and deliver presentations and go to conferences and whatever and be understood.
Thanks. There's someone's writing in saying, I have a teenage daughter and I find it fascinating how language is developing. Queer is now the preferred term for people from the LGBTQ plus community, whereas it used to be a slur. Dead naming is something that people do to insult trans people. And young people will never use the N word, even if they're quoting a text in which it is used. I'm not sure that that's a question, but maybe you could react to that.
Okay, there's a few different things there. We are much more sensitive now, all of us, to words directed against other people. So this is almost the new taboo, which is why, yes, they're avoiding it, because they regard these as being taboo words. Taboos used to be sex and bodily functions. Now everyone's fairly cool with that, but to say that someone is an N, or to say that they're, even to just say someone is fat, you just can't do it. It's taboo to that sentence. He is fat. It's not. It's the new taboo. But there are other things where it's simply a matter of language change and picking up on some Americanism. There was was it Seeker? There was a Black American English style of speaking where you use the opposite. So if something was bad, you meant it was good. It was really sick. It was fantastic. And so there was this opposite talk, and that was very popular for a while.
Great. Can you choose, do you have a favourite Australian word that has gone out of use?
Oh, there's one that I like. I have to run with what comes to mind. So fossick. I really like fossick. It's British dialect, but I don't think my son would use the term fossicking. It still survives for tourists out in, sort of digging opal and gold or whatever, where they set up a mullock heap and invite the tourists to fossick through to get little bits of gold or opal or whatever. But that's a very specialised and almost a museum existence for the word. It's a very nice word. It's from the ICK ending. Used to be popular in British English to say that you were doing something over and over again. And foss is just a variant of fuss. So if you're fossicking, you're fussing over and over to find the sock in the drawer. But I think it's on the way out.
Maybe because we don't use filing cabinets in the public service anymore. You can't go fossicking.
That's right. Yes, that's right. We don't have that instinct to preserve things and reuse things and whatever. You just go and buy new socks rather than fossick in the drawer for them.
Now, one American friend who's written in a question here, what about the migration of words in the other direction? He thinks that there are some great Australian words that have become cool outside of Australia.
Yes. Kath and Kim went to America. So muffin top became a thing in American English as well. And we've exported a few to Britain as well. no probs, I think, is something that other people have picked up on. There's not a lot, but there are a few things. Usually in Britain, it was because Neighbours ran there, I think, for quite some time. Usually it's associated with a TV program or a film or something like that. A few things go the other way.
Thank you. And another one, and we might be almost running out of time now. We've got 5 minutes left. Is there something particularly Australian about using extreme inventiveness with words like big cheese? The humorous use of, a kind of a send up.
Big cheese. I think Australians do like irony. And so to say something kind of exaggerating slightly and with the opposite meaning to it, I think that's appealing. Mostly we're good with phrases, or we had in the past been good with phrases where you make up the ending. So as mad as a cut snake is an old one, but as silly as a two bob watch is also an old one, but as useless as an ashtray on a motorbike. Is still around, apparently. As useless as a rhubarb on a skateboard, just to show that they are being updated and people are sort of finding new endings for these sorts of phrases. So I think that amuses Australians, and there's always been a bit of verbal play that we've been good at. Yeah.
Is that it?
I think we're just about there. I think there's, no.
Oh, yes.
Someone else has got another question. Oops.
Oh, yeah.
Nope, we have to mute you. Could you mute yourself, please?
She's muted. She just wants to talk. You want her to unmute herself? She's replaced. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so
Michelle, can you mute this person?
I can tell you, I can talk to you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just interested in the comment you made about emojis and this sort of half speak, which has really affected me during the lockdown, because I'm 79, but I've been typing since I was 12.
Mm-hmm.
So I really type as I think. And now with the lockdown, I'm not talking to people, but I'm, pounding away. And as you can see, I tend to do too much. But I'm just wondering whether my friends call me the talking fingers. And I'm just wondering whether that's common with other people, or is it just me? I realise that partly because when I'm talking with my fingers, people can't interrupt me. So they can't interject. I can be completely selfish, and I don't have to be a good listener, so to speak, because I can just put my own thoughts on paper. I'm just wondering whether that's common, because I've virtually lost the ability to. I can handwrite, of course, but I don't like doing it. I type everything. I type lists. Notes of what to do. Christmas is a nightmare because that's one thing where I have to actually handwrite cards, which I've just discovered Jackie Lawson, so I can even write cards now on the computer.
Thanks, Marion.
I don't think that's common. I think it is much, much more common for people to want to talk to each other, and we work out all sorts of ways in which to manage the exchanges of conversation, and we're very sensitive to if it's not fair. We feel that as a bit of a real insult. I can understand the attraction of writing things down, because as you write, you clarify your thinking, and you feel you've actually captured something properly by writing it down. In the heat of conversation, there's usually a lot of half-finished sentences and thoughts that go nowhere, and things that are expressed blurrily and so on. So for someone who wants to really capture what they're thinking, conversations can be probably fairly exasperating.
Yeah. All right, good. I think that's it for our questions. Again, thank you so much, Sue, for such an interesting evening with lots of humor and lots of insights into the words that we use, and some of them more correctly than others.